All right, welcome to all of our attendees today, and thank you for joining us for this webinar presented by Folk Alliance International. A few things that we'd like to cover before we begin today's webinar. We recognize the complexity and privilege of gathering online today by sharing a digital land acknowledgement written by Adrian Wong of the Spiderweb Show in Ontario and adapted for this webinar. Since our activities are shared digitally to the internet, let us all take a moment to acknowledge the legacy of colonization embedded within the technologies, structures, and ways of thinking that we use every day. We're using equipment and high-speed internet that's not readily available in all communities, and we invite everyone who's here today to join us in acknowledging our shared responsibility to make good of this time and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, and accompliceship. When you opened the webinar today, a control panel appeared on your screen. In that screen, in the chat box, you will find a link to access closed captioning. To submit your questions for consideration, please use the questions box in the control panel. And in addition, you'll also find a section there called handouts. There are some resource documents in there that have been provided for you to download. You can hide the control panel if you wish with a little orange arrow. We are mostly answering questions that were submitted in advance of today's webinar. There will be a brief live Q&A at around the 50-minute mark, so please do bear that in mind. And a recording and transcript of today's webinar will be posted online in the coming days. And a link to that recording will be sent to you in a follow-up email, but I will also put a link to that page in the chat box. And finally, when you close the webinar today, a short survey will appear. We would really appreciate any and all feedback, particularly feedback about what types of webinars you would like to see us present. So please take a moment to complete the survey. Okay, before we begin, it is time to take a couple of polls. So first off, let's find out who's in the room today. Please share with us what your industry role is. Artist, industry, that is to say agent, manager, publicist, media, presenter, or other. And we'll just take the temperature of the room and find out who we're speaking to and with today. All right. We have a high representation of artists here today to learn about the data. That's very exciting. Okay, so on the screen very shortly, you will see we're going to do a double poll. This is a new thing for us. You can see a list of data sources and tools that were brainstormed and provided to us by our esteemed panelists. So we'll just take a quick moment to scan the list. We're going to throw to that second poll in a minute and ask you, dear viewers, how actively you rely on these and similar tools in your work and career building, since many of you are artists. So assuming that you've had a moment to briefly scan these, and with the understanding that links to all of these resources are available in a handout in the handout section of the webinar, let's go to the poll. Please let us know, how actively do you rely on these data sources in your work? And there's a few options there. You use 3 or more of the tools, you have access to the tools but don't always use them, you're aware of the tools but don't have access, you're not aware of the data sources up until this very moment, in which case, congratulations on coming to this webinar, or you're unsure or prefer not to answer. We'll just give folks another quick minute to select their answer. I have access to 3 or more, but do not always use them, coming in at 42%. And I am aware of 3 or more, but do not have access. So most folks are accessing those tools. Okay, and 20% of you not aware of the tools. Fantastic. We hope you will avail yourself of that resource kit. Okay. Now it is time for us to begin this exciting data-driven conversation. And to guide us in this conversational journey, it is my great thrill to introduce you all to our moderator today, Folk Alliance International Program Manager, former board president of Folk Alliance International, a professor at Tennessee State University, a manager, and just an all-around amazing human being. Please welcome Michelle Conceison.
Thank you, Tressa. Tressa, you're also an amazing human being, and thank you for all the work you put in, and Jared, all the work that you put into creating these webinars, and certainly this one, which I'm very excited about. Thank you also to the viewers for sending us your questions and responding to the polls just now. That helps us have a sense of what's on your minds and what you hope to get out of our webinar. I'm excited to discuss this topic. I've been restraining myself as we were getting in before this panel. I'm just like, my voice is getting louder. I'm shaking with excitement. Let's talk about data. Finally, folk data. In the spring, when tours were canceled, as an artist manager, I, of course, helped artists pivot their activities to provide music to fans in a new way. And then not long after that, Nielsen came out with some research suggesting that audiences might have different wishes from what we were doing in our creative content our activities. So it felt important to me to have this conversation, understand the ways people are listening right now. We can learn a lot about the folk audience by looking at music consumption data. Our panel today is made up of individuals who live in and rely on data every day to make decisions. This conversation is about seeking understanding about what music listeners are doing, how they are behaving, what resonates, and what fans want. We organized this discussion into 4 categories and invited speakers equipped to speak in these areas: music consumption research, streaming trends, radio and viral video, data-driven decision-making, and we'll have a brief Q&A, as Tressa mentioned in her introductions. So what I will do is go to each of our speakers on each of these topics, and we'll come together to answer questions together. Hopefully we'll have some friendly discussion as we go throughout observations of what each of you are sharing. So certainly I look forward to a vibrant discussion. Let's start first, since the data from Nielsen is really what sparked the idea for this panel. Allow me to introduce to you all Scott Musgrave. He's the head of radio, Nielsen Music, MRC Data. Scott has prepared some slides to share with us, and will appear which will appear on the screen, but first you'll see here Scott's bio. You'll also find a link to a Nielsen research handout in the handout section. So welcome, Scott. And you are muted, my friend. Gotcha? Not yet?
There it goes.
There you are, my friend. Thank you very much. Thank you, Scott.
Okay. So I'm going to present data from a couple different sources right now, and it's going to allow you to be able to see kind of an overview of kind of 2 very timely topics. One is COVID-19 and what the impact has been on the music business, and a lot of things about what consumers out there are really perceiving as far as what the impact is on music consumption and kind of industry expectations overall. And I'm also going to look at some real pure consumption data, which comes from our Music Connect service. So a study, a COVID-19 study, and then also the music consumption data out of a product we have called Music Connect, which many of you may be familiar with. Just to give you some of the headlines on this to start, music streaming, both music and video streams, have declined in early June. This study that we looked at on COVID-19 was specifically from early June, but we're going to look at some numbers in a second across the last 6 months to a year to give you a sense of kind of what the impact there overall is. Physical sales, as stores are starting to reopen and independent and chain retailers are seeing an increase in physical album sales, we're going to look at that in terms of the impact from the pandemic. And it's interesting noting specifically that country and catalog music are continuing to experience gains, well, pretty much every other music genre. And folk is captured underneath not the country category, but under rock in most cases, at least in our Music Connect service. So for the most cases, it's been either unchanged or down a little bit overall as compared to to country. So we move to the next slide. What this is looking at, this is straight out of Music Connect. This is some streaming consumption data and some other consumption data as well. You can look at the three different periods really here are broken out, year to date through 3/12, so really just prior to COVID kicking in, 3/13 through 7/2, so really kind of the heart of the COVID impact, and then the year-over-year change, kind of seeing what's going to happening for each of these categories. From a total audio activity standpoint, you see that year-over-year, we're up 9.4%, only up 6% when you look at it during the COVID times. On-demand audio streaming up 13.8% during COVID, 16.2 overall. Album sales continue to be down. This is really just a continuation of a trend that we've had over the last few years. So this isn't really that dramatically different from what we've had over the last couple of years, but you see it maybe up a bit during COVID of 25% down because people can't buy physical albums as easily, at least in person. CDs follows suit with that, down 43.4%. Vinyl LPs down as well. People aren't selling them at shows as much, or even in record stores, physical record stores. And the same with digital albums and digital song sales. So it's really, when you're seeing the increases here, these are continuation of what's been happening over the last couple of years, and they were accelerated in some cases, up 16.2% from the on-demand audio streaming perspective. The next slide, when you look at here, is a simple slide. We're looking at the differences between video versus audio streaming. So early on during the pandemic, video was significantly higher on average versus audio. As we've gotten later into June, this goes through June 18th, you see that the two have really come back together, and it's much more normalized now than it was earlier on. So that's kind of a big change. On the next slide, what you're going to see is physical album sales. This is what I was mentioning a second ago. As states start to reopen, independent and chain stores are really seeing increases overall for the first time since the initial impact. So you're seeing that through the week ending 6/18 in terms of those physical sales starting to come back. And that obviously has an impact on especially the artists here in terms of starting to see this come back and really be a little bit better place for everybody concerned. On the next slide, I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to be going really more here to our COVID-19 study, where we asked consumers for, this is over 5 waves. This wave right now that you're looking at here is, we've done 5 different surveys. This one's from mid-June. It's the latest one that's out. We'll have another one out in about a week or two. But I think it's important to look at this study to see really what's the impact on live events. Obviously, everybody's seen, you know, where most live events have been shut down. So looking forward, you know, I think people are eager to get back to live events as much as, you know, they would like it more than really anything. I think especially big music fans are in that bucket, like many of us on this call. But it's very important that safety is taken into account. They want to feel safe. They want to make sure that the venues are accepting measures and restrictions that are going to help them feel more comfortable coming inside, in particular, to be able to be at a live event. And then the topic of virtual concerts is key, and that's something that's been getting us all through this time here. Consumers are still really interested in those virtual concerts, and they expect to see brands support artists and virtual concerts in a way that doesn't really disturb their viewing experience. On the next slide, we get into some of the actual data here, and this looks at the likelihood to attend live events. You know, what would it really require to make people feel comfortable about that and feel really comfortable starting to look at that? The key things you see on this chart here are empty seats around each group. Outdoor venues are much preferable to indoor, to be able to get people comfortable, to be able to consume live music in that kind of a setting. Masks, temperature checks, all these different things that are really trying to make people feel safe are really key, as a lot of venues are looking at the safe way to reopen for both indoor and outdoor events. And so you're seeing this really across the board here in terms of what it's going to take to kind of get us back to it, maybe not the real normal, but back to a new normal that we all have to do to be able to get live music moving again. On the next slide, you see, moving over to virtual concerts here, as states, you know, are reopening, virtual concerts are still something that we can look at as an alternative. And this gives you a chance over these 5 ways that I mentioned to you before. This is from back to mid-March to mid to early June. You're seeing how people's perceptions have changed about virtual concerts, and you're really, the change is not that significant as you look across these 5 waves. The percentage of people who have watched a virtual concert is about 20-22%. Stayed pretty consistent across all 5 waves. And do people really consider virtual concerts as an acceptable replacement or solution to a canceled event? About 20%-ish, 15 to 20% people are saying that. And when you ask, are they likely to stream a virtual concert in the next couple of weeks, higher than the people who've actually done it. So 22 versus 37% overall when we look at this across the board for this. So interesting insights here to look at when we're considering what's going to take to get people to do virtual concerts. That is all I have for my deck. I wanted to, I know you just said a second ago, no questions as we go, but I didn't know that was the slide here, obviously.
No, that's all right. And Scott, this is great. I appreciate this. I made note of a couple things to follow up on, and we'll just move through our speakers and ask questions after each have spoken, I think.
Great.
So thank you very much, Scott. So please, as a second speaker, please let me introduce to you Nikki Lee. Nikki is a data scientist in the music analytics division of Spotify. Thank you for joining us, Nikki. Also, I just want to note, as we're speaking, we're going to talk about some articles. So make sure you have your chat box open because we will post the links that are referred to in this conversation in that chat box. That's for the viewers. Nikki, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So we've just seen some sort of overarching data from Scott. I'm curious to hear the Spotify perspective. What music consumption patterns and changes in listening behavior has Spotify observed in recent months?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. So I think, as you said, the links should be posted. There's one really interesting newsroom article on our blog that talks about changes in consumption since coronavirus. I think one of the most interesting things there that I'll highlight is that we've seen an increase in chill music. So chill being not a super scientific word, but how we define that is kind of just like the low energy, exactly what you would think of if somebody says like, I like chill music. So it's more like low key stuff. And so we've seen an increase in that type of music. And you might have that same experience, like in the beginning of coronavirus times, it was a lot of staying at home, trying to find peace and like relax and not be stressed out. So that's been really interesting to see. And I think another really key interesting thing that we've seen is changes in like listening times and behaviors. So obviously, as a lot of countries went into shelter in place and people started working from home, we saw a decline in commute hours and streaming during commute hours. So that used to be a really big pattern Monday through Friday, where you'd see kind of like 2 bumps in the morning commute and the evening commute when everyone's listening and streaming. And we definitely don't see that, or we didn't see that when we went into shelter in place. And instead, this is kind of a fun thing, like every day kind of looked like a Sunday for us. Whereas like Saturday and Sunday, the streaming patterns are a little bit different. And Monday through Friday started looking like that too, where people are streaming later at night, like all day throughout the day, like without bumps during commute. So those are some of the big changes that we've seen.
I wonder if you could expand a little on the, well, first I'll say it occurs to me, I saw you smile when she talked about this, and I imagine we're also going to talk about drive times, which is kind of similar in radio. So we'll come to that in a second. But Nikki, I wonder if you could expand a little on the chill music observations. Sort of how do you make that observation when you're looking at the data? Are you looking at playlists that are based on a mood? Are you looking at genre playlists? Is it a combination of both? Sort of how does Spotify figure that out?
Yeah, good question. So I guess like not too technically speaking, but just how we figure that out, we have a way to just identify like chill, like different types of music. And so chill is kind of like a feature of songs that we might know, and just knowing like, you know, there's more of those songs that are being streamed. But on that note, we do see this across both like the genre and the playlist. So we were seeing increases in more chill, traditionally chill genres. So folk, a little bit of country, classical, soul music, a lot of the increases were there. And we saw declines in the more traditionally like not chill or like upbeat music, like hip hop and Latin. We saw declines there. So that's like one of the ways that we saw chill tracks just kind of, it aggregated up to the genre level. And then also on playlists, yeah, like users were listening to a lot more chill playlists. And so including Spotify curated ones. There's a fact out there that Chill Vibes, which is a Spotify playlist with a bunch of like low key kind of electronic-y music, that tripled in listeners and saves since coronavirus. And so that's like one of the big playlists that's chill music. People were looking for that. So across the board, yeah, we definitely see it in genres and in playlists.
It's interesting to think how we're faring. Ayapa, you are muted. Do you want to add something there?
Yeah, one thing I can chime in on too in terms of vibe and lyrical content. In the folk community, so much of what the artists are able to do is speak without and create music without studio gimmicks and tricks and trickeration. So the music that they're creating is more about a heartfelt connection between themselves and the audience. And so what we've noticed is in the folk community, what's been helpful is lyrical content that's really driving it. And Nikki, what you're talking about too is the vibe is really important. So one of the things that we've done is we've gone through both the frontline current artists that we have at Concord and our suite of labels, as well as the catalog, and doing things like Nathaniel Rateliff's And It's Still All Right and Time Stands, that talks about it, we're gonna get through this together, but then also being honest and kind of dealing with the situation where we are these days, like a Billy Strings song, Home, or Della Mae's I Like It When You're Home, and Sarah Jaros's Hometown, and kind of almost having fun with the lyrical content that can connect with the listener where they're at right now, and then having moments where folks can also kind of feel like they can escape, whether it's a Sierra Hull song Escape or Lucas Nelson and Promise of the Rails Turn Off the News, Build a Garden, Valerie June's Astral Plane. Those are the things that we've been noticing that speak to what Nikki's been saying, is how do you connect in terms of meeting the listener in what their needs are right now. We can talk more about that further and going into the catalog side, but just Nikki make a great point about what is it that listeners want, and the artists, since there's a plurality of artists in the room, think about how it is that you can connect with your audience around you that either knows who you are or isn't aware of who you are, but is looking for something to crave the emotional need that we're all experiencing.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you talk about like the lyrical and like connecting with the fans aspect, because just overall in the music industry, what we see is like bedroom pop, the bedroom pop genre becoming really popular among the younger audience, and just like the generational kind of trends that we've seen is like the younger new generation liking more of that, like I made this in my room without production value, like I connect with you, and that kind of thing is really big with the young people. So that's really interesting that you bring that up.
I have another question for you, Nikki, about another item that was in one of the articles in your newsroom, the one that was posted earlier. In that article, it also speaks to a trend in a spike in listening when the artist is doing live streams. So while Scott just showed us some data suggesting, which is, it's so human, right? 34, 37, 40% of people intend to watch a live stream and 20% do, right? Or something like, it was in that ballpark. You'll forgive me if it's not perfect, but you know, we're looking at that. But then what's interesting about the article that's come out of your newsroom is that you're seeing a spike in actual Spotify streaming on artists who are live streaming. So sort of the live streaming having a halo effect or a residual effect. And I'm just curious, have you been able to tell if these are temporary spikes? Have they led to continuous more listening of those artists? Can you tell us more about that data point?
Yeah, so we looked at this back in, I think it was March or the beginning of April. So it was like the beginning of all of this craziness. And we looked across a wide range of artists, and we did see, on average, like most artists who did a live stream would see an increase in Spotify streams afterwards, right? So it's users like, I go to this live stream, I like this artist, and then that kind of just it reminds me how much I like this artist. I go onto Spotify, I like listen to their entire album. It's like, what would happen after you went to a concert? Most users like do that, right? I do that. I like binge listen to everything. And so it depends on the artist, and it depends a lot on like a lot of other factors surrounding it, but mostly temporary spikes. It's not that you'll go from, let's say, like 1,000 listeners to like jump to 2,000 and that'll stay forever. So it mostly was temporary, but we do see like variety based on, I'm gonna kind of jump to like one thing I thought about, which is just like collaborations within the music industry. Obviously, Taylor Swift just released a big album with Bon Iver, and like Taylor is now the #1 most streamed artist in a day, and like it was a big smash hit. And I can only imagine that's like amazing for Bon Iver too, just like that cross collaboration. And so I could imagine like even for live streaming, if you get a bunch of people together, you do a live stream, that would just help everybody.
I need to get more fluent in my muting and unmuting. I apologize. That's great, Nikki. That's a great start. I'm going to move on to our next speaker, and we'll continue to come back to this. I have a couple follow-up questions there too. So next up we have, and you've heard some delightful input from him already, is our good friend Ayapa Bedanda. He's the Senior Director of National Grassroots Video and Tour Promotion at Concord. Ayapa, welcome.
It's good to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So, Ayapa, labels usually support what artists create, right? You're usually in a position of artists create something, they come to you and say, help us get it out there. And certainly a lot of questions we are receiving are about how can we get our music out there in this time. Historically, touring has been a huge part of that, and a huge part of the label's marketing equation, with ticket, record, and merch sales as the measurable outcomes. How are you measuring effectiveness right now? How have metrics that you're looking at changed in this time with the artists you're working with?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Michelle. We don't have the ticket sales. We don't have the merch per head to look at to see how successful is an artist performing, how are they connecting, how deep is the engagement. So we're looking to pivot and look at other data points. We're looking at how do artists connect in absentia. When they can't be there physically, what is the way that their art is able to reach the masses? So we're looking at streaming, both audio and video. We're looking at live stream engagement when artists are able to create from their own space. What kind of engagement is that? How do we build communities? And more than that, how do we build ongoing audiences? The kind of silver lining, if we have to look at it from in a pandemic, if there is any silver lining, it's that artists are here and creating and able to give voice to all that we're feeling. So as a music fan, which each of us on this panel are first and foremost, I can't create a lick of music, but I'm so grateful that each of the artists in this room can. And our job is to amplify what your work is doing. So we need to be thinking about what is it that's special about you? What is your perspective on the situation? How do we provide an audience that A, already knows who you are and build deeper roots, and B, how do we reach new people and new communities who would be attracted to what you're doing? That's the kind of situation that you're facing every single day. So we talk about different opportunities. We look at live streaming. That's one of the things that has really been important to our artists. In one space, it's working with the relationships that we have and having radio stations doing Instagram lives and suggesting to them artists that are able to do it. A lot of the artists that are watching this might not have that infrastructure, but if you have your instrument, if you have a web connection and you're able to go direct, then you have the infrastructure to reach the people. So then we need to think about live streaming. What's a good strategy for you? We've had some really good successes in Indigo Girls and Sarah Jaros worlds, and we can talk about that more as case studies if we're interested. But the difficulty is Indigo Girls are 2 people. Not everyone has a 35-year history to be able to build from that audience. But what we do see is when they first started, they were one of the first artists to go on live stream platform, and they had 60,000 people tune in. It was because there was hunger, there was a craving for connection, and there was a craving for people to say, we're not in this alone, we're in this together. So that's the same type of thing. It might be at a different scale that you and your audience have, but you need to be thinking about what is it that you can speak to, who are the relationships you have, and what Nikki was talking about, that collaboration element is absolutely vital. You might not have Taylor Swift's or Bon Iver's information, but you have the number of a friend that's not just in your town, but also look at this as an opportunity to look across country and some of the artist networks that you have and across continents to see what are some really interesting collaborations that travel now that that is out of the picture, but having cyber connection allows us to do. You might find more thriving and fruitful connections these days than ever before. What would a collaboration with yourself and an artist in Africa sound like? What would an artist between yourself and an artist in Asia sound like? You don't have to worry about showing up in person. The audience is going to be much more forgiving about maybe sound quality and things like that, but they're really interested in the idea and the spirit. So if you're able to foster new relationships and put yourself in a space where you're doing something on an ongoing, regular type of series, then you're going to have an experience that more likely than not is going to be a snowball effect. So those are some of the types of ways that, sure, we can't look at tour sales anymore, but we can absolutely look at engagement. We can look at revenue when you're doing things that are helping build who you are as an artist. Having a virtual tip jar, of course, is great, but more important than that is just having a link that allows people to see who you are, what your web store is. Make sure you have a robust merch page on your website, so when new people do find out about you, they see what your content is, what your music is, what your merch is, and make sure you're creating merch that speaks to these times. The more relevant you are, the more interesting you are. That's the folk nature. That's why we listen to artists from 50, 60, 70 years ago, and they still are relevant as today. That's some of the stuff that we found in our listening as well, is gospel music in our space is something that has seen a high increase. And so something that we've been fortunate to do, this is more to the label side, we've been able to go through the Stax vaults, and every week we're re-releasing a gospel album that had never been available on DSPs before, on streaming platforms. And now every single week we've got a new gospel album that's coming out. It's called the Gospel Truth Series, and that's going to be leading to a physical release in September during Gospel Heritage Month. But again, this is about music that provides comfort, hope, looking forward, and it's a way that might have been music that was lost 40 years ago, 60 years ago, but now is finding a new audience. And these are the types of things that we find is connecting. The music from 1968 is as relevant today socio-politically as ever before. How can the music that you find inspiring from 40 years ago, maybe you cover one of your favorite protest songs from the 60s. We need music that speaks to these times, whether it's comfort, whether it's protest, whether it's giving a platform to other voices. That's how you make yourself relevant.
Your call to action is real. I feel ready to go. I'm not even a musician. I'm ready to go make an album. I mean, let's go sing some protest songs. I love it. And I think you're right. I think something you're getting into here, and I'm going to put a pin in this one for a second, because I think Brittany is going to want to talk about this too, is catalog. I think it's come up a couple different times, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But first, I'm going to make you turn your attention for a moment, IAPA, to radio, right? Folk radio is such a huge and vibrant part of our community, our Folk Alliance community, and our folk ethos in a lot of ways. I'm interested to talk about radio listeners and what we're seeing in terms of radio listening audiences, how they're behaving now that they're not in their cars as much and they're online. But also, it's been very hard to keep up with, since the folk radio programming side of things is diverse, and you know, some folks are doing a radio show for multiple hours on a radio station on a certain day of the week. They've been doing that for years, but they've been doing that in person. and they're carrying their music into the radio station with them. We hear those stories all the time. So I'm curious what you're seeing in terms of folk radio programming as well as listening.
I am happy to report the state of folk radio is strong, but we are in a position of pivoting and transition. One of the reports that I've been hearing from folk programmers is they're dealing with multiple situations. In many cases, their radio stations are on college campuses, which have been locked down. So that's a barrier to how do you actually get to the station to put your show on air. Another situation, the mail has been difficult for artists and for labels and reps to be able to distribute CDs on hard copy. So I do see a pivoting to digital right now. So it is very important that as artists that you make yourself, make your music available digitally. DJs who previously had said, I'm never going to download a CD are turning around and saying, you know what, I need to download that music digitally. And so it is pushing people forward.
Yay!
That is a good thing. That is a good thing. Make sure you provide your liner notes, your album credits. Make sure you provide all that digitally as well too. That's very key. That's what the DJs want, to share your full story. So that is part and parcel with sending the WAV file as well. But looking at the hard numbers, the Folk Alliance International Folk Chart, which is one of the resources we spoke to, and you should make sure you go to folkradio.org when you can. They have a panel of folk DJs who report on a monthly basis, and pre-shutdown, we were at about 125 reporters consistently. That did dip down to 100 during the midst of the lockdown in April, and that slowly is returning, and the most recent data we have is for June, when we had 115. So it's back and going stronger, and I think this next month I expect even a larger number. Also on the station front, in terms of overall listening, while our overall cumulative audience might be down a hair, which is what the numbers are showing, the time spent listening is longer. So you might not have as many people listening to what Nikki was speaking to in terms of drive time, kind of checking you out for 15 minutes on their way to work. In Los Angeles, maybe an hour and a half. But here in places like Nashville, you've got people who are listening all day long. When they work at home, they listen to their favorite station, whether it's their hometown station or something across the country. So radio stations, you really have an opportunity to go and think broader as well. Pledge drives that have been going on during the lockdown have been, in some cases, more successful than ever, because radio stations, and I'm going to put this on a microcosm, folk stations, folk programmers are showing, again, relevancy. People need to hear, how is the lockdown affecting my community? Radio is better able to handle that question than any other platform, because there's a dialogue, because there's a person on the other end of that microphone, because we're listening as a community. So think about what we have to offer and make sure we're using all of those assets. And we can talk further to it, but I know we have other people.
That's great news, Ayapa. That's great news to hear about folk radio. I do want to move. Brittany, you have been so patient, but there's a reason. There's a reason we're coming to you now. Brittany, thank you for your patience. I want to welcome Brittany Foreman. She's a senior data analytics manager at Tempo Music Investments and has worked in analytics across the music industry. Having worked at Song Trust, Downtown Music Publishing, Pandora, Next Big Sound, we are eager to have your perspective on some questions I have for you and also what we've heard so far. So welcome, Brittany.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
I am wondering, I'm wondering from the investment perspective, from the catalog perspective, from the publishing perspective, what can be learned about listening audiences from the data that publishers can see? How is that different from the other data, and how can that data be leveraged to make investment decisions?
Well, at least I do. I can't speak for everyone. I believe that data doesn't live in a vacuum. So while we are looking at listening metrics and essentially where these audiences live, if it's a US native or if it's ex-US, I like to look at different metrics that might correlate, like what their audience is. So not just like on streaming, but do they have airplay? Do they have an audience? Do they have people that they engage? Because I think at the very core of music industry, and I think we've touched on this, is you want that authentic connection. And so if we're going to invest in somebody, we want to make sure that they have an audience. And so I like to look at the data and essentially validate if they have people that are on the other end and listening. So like, who are they making this music for, and is it being received? And so I look at different data platforms. I use Nielsen a lot, so much. I look at like sound charts. I like to see like international radio play, and just kind of like balance it like in terms of what is the breakdown between terrestrial radio versus streaming, knowing that we're moving more towards digital. Are they early adopters of different platforms where they have an audience? Are they late adopters, and kind of where they are in that? In terms of essentially ironcladding that it will be a good investment. But I think to a degree, any music publisher, any label, any investment firm that you talk to as an artist or a creator, you want to be able to know your data, but also they're looking to make sure that they have a return on investment. And so I think across the board, all of those different companies are looking at those metrics.
Brilliant. You know, Brittany, I appreciated we had a nice chat before all this. And you've been at really the cutting edge of music analytics in multiple areas of the industry, so you have a unique perspective on this. I know that data literacy in music is really important to you. You said data literacy in our conversation. I had to write it down because I'm like, yes, yes. What are your big picture observations about everything you've heard so far in this conversation? What are the things that have been jumping out to you? And maybe also, how can we use this type of information to make data-driven decisions as creators of music?
That is a very excellent question, and this is kind of like one of my favorite things to sit down with creators, because creators kind of see themselves as artists, which they inherently are. However, they're also entrepreneurs, they're businesses, they are working in this ecosystem, in this industry. And so just like any mom and pop shops or any company, you'd want to know like how well your marketing's doing, how well your inventory is doing, and that is your data. So being able to take stock of what your data and how you're performing is incredibly important, and being able to read that data and know what it means gives you a lot more leverage when you're talking to people about what you do and your craft, but also makes a more compelling story. Like being a really good data scientist or data analyst means you tell a really good story, but you're able to back it up with facts. And I think as a creative community, we're really good at storytelling, but being able to back it up with facts also helps you in the music industry, because again, everybody wants a really good return on investment. And when you walk into meetings with a label or a radio station and you're able to tell them, I've been getting this many plays in this many markets, I've been able to sell out these shows back when we had like shows and like actual live shows, or like these live streams, that this is how successful they've been, people will feel more assured that, okay, if we take a gamble or take a bet on you, these numbers sound great. I feel a lot more comfortable in this decision to try something I may not have tried before, especially if you are in probably not more of the mainstream genres, especially with folk. Just be like, well, here's our numbers. Like they're comparable, and especially if you can comp them to somebody else, it's like, well, you play this artist, they do these numbers, I do these numbers. So as you can tell, if you play something that sounds like this, you definitely want to bet on me. And that's generally how you kind of like inch your way in. Because I like to give people those ways in, just like, we'll point to the numbers. Do you have something you can show somebody that will make them more comfortable? That's essentially what you're doing. Like, instead of selling yourself and just kind of here's my story, and like, I worked so hard and I wrote these songs, which absolutely is part of your story. Sometimes when it comes to making business decisions, just be like, well, and also I have a 50% conversion rate on Spotify of turning like listeners into monthly followers. And that is a far more interesting metric than just kind of like, well, people listen. Like, I had this many streams. Well, how many are now engaged followers? How many are just like, oh, I heard you on a playlist, I heard your song, versus like, I heard your song and then I clicked follow. That is something that's far more engaging and far more compelling in your story. That's like, not only are you making good music, you're making music that people connect to. Sorry, I talk really fast. I get really excited about these things.
No, you do it. That's great. No, we love excitement. So what you're speaking to a little bit, and I think this has come up at different times in this conversation, is the notion of reach and engagement, right? I wonder if we can all, I'm going to start with you, Brittany, with this question, but I think it might be a nice way to move us into a group discussion and Q&A period of, you know, let's roll up our sleeves a little bit and reveal a few of our they're not super secrets, don't worry, but as people who all work with data in your work and you're trying to pull out different metrics and tell that story, I wonder if we can speak to kind of what advice you'd give our members about how to organize the data that they have access to. So we've been talking about these big trends in research and data we don't necessarily have access to. But now let's talk a little bit about, you know, what the data our artists and labels and managers and people in our community have access to. How can they establish that the data that they're looking at is enough information to make decisions? Is it statistically significant? And how can they pull out those insights? Maybe a couple stories, like what's the metric? If you had to pick 3 metrics you love most this month, what would it be? Just kind of getting some of that vocabulary. Like Brittany, you just talked about, you know, a conversion rate on Spotify. And I think that if we could start talking about some of those types of metrics, it might help our audience.
Absolutely. When I'm looking at Nielsen data, I look mostly at on-demand, things that people are far more engaged in. Programmatic is great. Lean back services are great. Playlisting is amazing. I love to just hit play and keep going. However, something that kind of denotes a little bit more engagement and a little bit more intent on the point of listener is people who are like looking specifically for this track. And then our on demand is just like, I want to listen to this, or I want to listen to this album ad nauseum until like I know all of the words backwards and forwards and my neighbors are banging on my wall. Like those are the things that are far more compelling to me. Like I want to know like how many people are engaged to go find these artists and like what platforms can I look for that. Like if YouTube plays like specifically instead of like playlisting, it's like, oh, they specifically went and sought out this content. And engagement, that's kind of where the top line of it. Like an audience is great. However, that we still live in an economy, you can buy followers. I want to know how many people are engaged with you, how many people want to have a conversation with you or interact with your music. For me, when I make decisions or when my team is making decisions, that is the thing that we bring up the most, that, okay, so great, they have an audience, it's here, it's there, but how, like, engagement also denotes like how many people will pay money for your content, because that is how everybody pays the rent at this point. So we want to make sure that there is an audience that is engaged.
I'm going to toss this to others too. And what's interesting is, Lauren, you're out there. You asked the question of what would you say are the top 5 to 10 metrics for a folk musician to pay attention to, which is it's just right in line with, you beat me to it, Lauren. So Brittany, what are your 3 to 5 favorite metrics? If you thought a folk musician should look at only 3 to 5 metrics, what would they be?
Ooh,
and if you want to punt, you can. We'll come back, but I think you've got it.
Okay, so because I've been talking about on-demand data, especially because we're moving to like where I think the IFPI said we're like 50% digital in terms of our revenue. I would look at like your streaming numbers, mostly on demand. So that is your YouTube, your Spotify, Pandora has also on demand. So like how you're doing across all of the DSPs, because some DSPs favor different genres differently. So, and also different voices. So you kind of want to look at your streaming numbers. You want to look at your YouTube video if you're making visual content and putting it on YouTube or Vimeo, kind of see like engaging in that and like making sure your royalties. Instagram and TikTok have become really good social platforms in terms of getting audience, especially as we are now all on lockdown and kind of like all in front of our screens all day, every day. And there was one more. You said 3 to 5. So I'm gonna tap out now because I don't want to sit here.
That's okay. Who wants next? Free for all, IAPA.
Yeah, let's see. For us, we're interested in making sure artists get paid. So I would say number one is merch bundles, and what kind of engagement do you have with not just your album sales, but in terms of your entire merch line? Again, you are more than just the notes. You are part of a bigger identity. So what kind of ways is your identity being connected, and are you getting revenue for that? So I would say that's very important. As an artist, we want you to pay your bills. And kind of speak to what Brittany and Nikki and Scott have all been saying, Spotify followers is really important, because as great as the listens are, you want that listener to be connected and following you for the span of your career. And a Spotify on a global level is fantastic. On a domestic level here in the US, for Pandora, I would say artist station ads are really important. And that's something that you get a way to capture them in an ongoing way, and definitely be making sure that you are sharing your playlists that you put on all sorts of DSPs on Pandora as well, because they have a great both on-demand and radio service. And then YouTube subscribers, because again, that's a global platform. You're going to be creating videos. When you do live streams, there's ways you can then import that onto YouTube and continue to not just make revenue, but gain exposure and visibility. And if you are doing the collaborative model, there's ways to benefit both sides of the artist audiences respectively. So those are a few of my favorites.
So I'm going to interrupt my own question, and Scott and Nikki, if you'd like to still give us your favorite metric, you can do that in this next one. But we got a great question from Jody. Jody Whelan, hello, my friend. Has anyone seen data that the pandemic has accelerated older audiences' adoption of streaming? So has I wonder if Nielsen has done any breaking out of age group on that, or if you're aware of that. And if you don't have that in your mind right now, that's okay. If you can point us to that, yes, it's there and we can find it. Or Nikki, or I wonder if anyone's seeing age demographic data on streaming adoption.
We don't have access to age in our streaming, in our on-demand streaming data today. It's something that the DSPs do have, and so, Nikki, maybe you'll answer this better because you may have a little bit more access to some of that data, maybe from some of your research, but we don't have it, so I haven't seen a study on that in terms of the aging of streamers.
This is like my least favorite part, because I have to say I don't think I can speak on this.
That's okay. That's okay.
Yet publicly, but I can insert a little advertisement, not advertisement, it's a tool. But if you aren't familiar with Spotify for Artists, where you get all your analytics as an artist, you can see the breakout of your listeners by age group. So it's a totally kind of pivot. I'm just totally pivoting. But if you want to see
it's relevant.
If you want to see your own followers and your listeners, and if you see changes in the age groups there, like that could be interesting. And while I'm on that, I will just answer the previous question. I think something to add on to all the metrics that have already been mentioned, something that I think would be really interesting for artists is in Spotify for Artists, when you go to your audience, you can actually see like how many streams you have, how many listeners you have, and how many followers you have. So you can compare the people who are listening to you versus the people who have been following you. You can also see where your streams are coming from. So whether they're coming from a Spotify playlist, whether they're coming from people searching for your album, or whether your tracks have been added to users' own playlists. And you can see that breakout. And I think as an artist, it'd be amazing to see that I'm playlisted in people's own playlists. Like they saved me and they, added me to their library. So those are some interesting insights you can get from Spotify analytics.
That's excellent. That's excellent information and a good reminder of the types of data you can find. Ayapa, were you just speaking?
A little bit, yeah. On the age front, we don't necessarily have data that I've seen about streaming specifically, but we do in terms of radio discovery by age bracket, in terms of what content are different age groups looking for. And it's interesting because in the non-comm folk space, what we've found is the listeners in the older demographic aren't looking for radio to serve them new music discovery nearly as much as the 20-somethings. They're looking for familiarity and comfort. And so that's why there's a reason why we're reissuing a lot of our albums, whether it's Fania and Pete Rodriguez's I Like It Like That, or some of the Stax albums, because folks are looking for what they're comfortable with. On the younger side, they are hungry for music discovery, and so we want to find out how do we super serve that need, and on what platforms if it's not radio. So that, again, as the artist, think about what is the target group that you're looking for, who is it that you feel connected to, and how do you serve that up? Is it, again, doing music that's more comfortable? Is it doing kids music and music for parents who might be in lockdown with toddlers running around? Or is it for peers your age? So think about different audiences and how your music can be flexible in fitting different interests.
So we've got only a few minutes left. I feel like we could talk for 2 hours. I want more hours with all of you. You are a wealth of information. I wonder, in the last few moments, and I do want to prepare everyone that the way our webinars work, they end abruptly if we would hit the minute. So just a final thought, perhaps about how to watch trends as we go. I mean, a lot of people had questions about live stream concert trends and whether fans are willing to pay, whether they're willing to attend. I appreciate, Scott, the data that you shared on that, because it's really interesting to look at that over time. 20% is not a lot of people. So, any parting thoughts on how to follow the data and witness trends as things change? Or anything else you missed that you really wanted to say and I didn't let you say it?
One thing I do want to point out, I forgot to mention when I was showing my slides is, as you know, Michelle, I gave it to the handout after a deck of about, I think it's 20 plus slides. So there's a lot more detail on some of these topics we've been talking about in that deck, which you all will have access to as a follow-up to this. So feel free to look at that, because it will give you a little bit more detail and answers on some of that.
It is excellent. Those reports from Nielsen have really helped me as a manager in this time.
I can quickly add.
Oh, go ahead, Nikki.
I'll be quick. I'm watching
Nikki and then Ayapa.
Yeah, something that I didn't mention is just an increase during these times, like very specific at-home activity playlists. So we've seen a rise in like workout playlists, work from home playlists, like things that are very specific home activities, because we're all there. And so even in terms of live streaming, I'm just thinking like a workout folk live stream, or like cooking. We had a lot of these cooking together playlists, like just trying to soundtrack your home experience.
Hey, I see Tressa.
I hate to interrupt this conversation because I, as an artist and also industry member, have learned so much, but alas, we have reached the end of our time together today. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today for this webinar that's presented by Folk Alliance International. We hope that you found the ideas presented useful to you, as I have to my own personal self. But really, I think we can all join together virtually in a huge thank you to our esteemed panelists, Nikki Lee, Ayapa Vedanta, Brittany Foreman, Scott Musgrave, and of course, our intrepid moderator, Michelle Conceison, for this great time together. And yes, you will find all the handouts referenced attached to this webinar, as well as a few links to future website offerings in the chat box there. This webinar will be available on the Folk Alliance YouTube channel. Please do take a moment to provide some feedback in our survey, again, specifically about what you would like us to present to you. Give us the data so we can respond. In the meantime, stay safe and connected, community. Thanks again, panelists, and we will see you all next time. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.